You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Popular Resistance has a piece entitled "The FBI's Crusade Against MLK Was Darker Than You Think." Robert Scheer talks with filmmaker Sam Pollard. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled "The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism." Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Quote, "I know that the notion of informants in organizations like SCLC is probably still happening today in the Black Lives Matter movement," says Sam Pollard. "The FBI has not all of a sudden become clean and upright and upstanding. They still do those kinds of shenanigans in any kind of movement that they feel is radical, be it black movements or white supremacist movements. They still have informants. They still have monitoring, surveilling those organizations," end quote. And Dr. Horne, if you throw into that Matt Taibbi's investigation into the Twitter files, you have a huge mess on your hands, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, it's no secret that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, particularly under the leadership of its pugnacious bulldog-like director, one J. Edgar Hoover, who served for over a half century, was a malevolent and evil force going back to the 1920s when it was behind the deportation of Marcus Messiah Garvey, the Jamaican migrant who helped to build a black nationalist organization. We're all familiar with COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, circa 1956, ostensibly aimed at the U.S. Communist Party, but rapidly spreading its tentacles into the emerging anti-Jim Crow movement. J. Edgar Hoover had a particular animosity towards Martin Luther King Jr. Recall that he tried to induce Martin Luther King to commit suicide by mailing him a tape purportedly representing some midnight assassinations between Mr. King, Dr. King, and women who were not his spouse. Dr. King did not snap at the bait, and that seemed to infuriate J. Edgar Hoover. And we also know, based upon the post-assassination congressional investigation led by Congressional Black Caucus member, the late Louis Stokes of Cleveland, that there was a conspiracy to kill Dr. King. The idea that a lone crazed gunman by the name of James Earl Ray was solely responsible is the height of fantasy. And we also know that even before the assassination of Dr. King, that J. Edgar Hoover was putting pressure on Dr. King to get rid of Jack O'Dell. Many in your audience probably knew Jack O'Dell. He was a former chairman of the board of Pacifica Radio, a close aide to Jesse Jackson and Dr. King. But Dr. King would not break ties with Jack O'Dell. The FBI charged that Jack had been or was a member of the U.S. Communist Party and therefore was a security risk. And that failure of Dr. King to break ties with Jack O'Dell further infuriated and inflamed the FBI. And to fast forward to the recent past, I've just plowed through the January 6th report looking into the insurrection on Capitol Hill in 2021. And one of the noticeable omissions in that lengthy, almost 800-page report is the fact that there is an attempt to act as if Donald J. Trump was solely and exclusively responsible for the insurrection, while ignoring the role of the national security establishment, not only the intelligence agencies, which would include the FBI, which seemed to be rather laggard in getting up to speed and reporting on what was going on in ultra right-wing circles in the run-up to January 6th, Not to mention the lethargy with which the National Guard and the Pentagon responded to forces marauding on the Capitol, building a gallows to lynch the U.S. vice president, etc. So the footnote I would make with regard to what Sam Pollard said in that popular resistance piece is that the FBI has a particular animus towards black movements, there's a particular animus towards left-wing movements. Oftentimes it actually collaborates and cooperates with right-wing movements. That's the import, for example, of the fact that in the mid-1960s, when Viola Liuzzo, a Michigan Italian-American activist, was assassinated in Alabama, apparently the FBI had reason to know that this was about to happen because it was part of the Ku Klux Klan-like forces, but then did not intervene to stop her murder. So this is a very dangerous and perilous country in which we reside. And the sooner that we come to that realization, the better.
Really quickly, Dr. Horne, wasn't Jack O'Dell designated the most dangerous man in America at one point in his career by the FBI?
Well, most certainly, although in all fairness, that label has been affixed to Dr. King as well. But it's rather curious to affix it to Jack O'Dell. You may recall he was rather diminutive, about 5'6", 5'7", maybe about 145 pounds, dripping wet. He was a brilliant organizer. And sadly, he spent his last days in exile in Vancouver, British Columbia, because of the discomfort he obviously felt in being in the land of his birth.
Dr. Horne, Betsy Madger wrote an interesting book called The Burglary, The Discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's Secret FBI. And she has an article back in 2014. And it was in The Nation, called Just Being Black Was Enough to Get Yourself Spied On by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. When she looks into it, what she finds is it wasn't just Dr. King's and the Black Panthers, that the FBI was so paranoid about Black people that they were assigning their agents to have people in Black churches, in Black barbershops. Anywhere they were Black people, they had this fear. If there were Black lawyers, they literally said, well, any lawyer can turn out to be a crook. So they viewed Blackness itself as an entity that they had to suppress and control, and as some kind of a subversive element in our society. Your thoughts?
Well, once again, I would point your audience to the new biography of J. Edgar Hoover by Beverly Gage of Yale University. Interestingly enough, J. Edgar Hoover had roots right there in Washington, D.C., and perhaps because of his obsession with Black people, the rumor was floated that he himself might have been part Black. Apparently, that was not the case, underlined apparently. But his obsession with Black people, of course, was consistent, I'm afraid to say, with the founding of this country, because even though it's an inconvenient truth, the fact of the matter is that when there was a revolt against British rule in 1776, the enslaved population did not decide to engage in class collaboration and fight alongside their so-called masters, led by slaveholders like Washington and Jefferson. And since that time, Black people have been viewed as enemies of the state. In fact, there was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book a few years ago called The Internal Enemy. Guess who the internal enemy happened to be?
I think it's us.
Well, obviously, the internal enemy during slavery times was Black people, because we were willing to collaborate with the real and imagined foes of Washington. And that perception has continued to this very day.
The Amsterdam News had a piece back in April of 2022. U.S. government found guilty of assassinating Dr. King. And they say during the trial, the government's carefully interwoven plot to kill Dr. King was revealed. Lloyd Jowers said the kill shot was fired from behind his Jim's Grill, which was close to the Lorraine Motel. That's where the balcony upon which Dr. King was standing. It was determined that local, state, and U.S. federal government agencies and the mafia were involved. Your thoughts on that coalition of entities that were involved in the suppression? And it's important for people to always understand the movement for freedom in the United States.
Well, it would not be surprising if that story happened to be accurate. A similar coalition purportedly was involved in the assassination of the U.S. president on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. Speaking of John F. Kennedy, I think it's very curious that when Dr. King was assassinated, James Earl Ray, the purported assassin, seemingly glided with little difficulty from Tennessee to Canada to Europe and was on his way, interestingly enough, to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, but then a white minority regime, before he was detained. There are a lot of questions still remaining about the assassination of Dr. King. Louis Stokes, a congressional committee, already noted both investigated both the Kennedy and King assassinations and raised many questions. But recall that just a few days ago, the Biden administration refused to release thousands of pages of documents with regard to the national security agencies and the assassination of JFK, the U.S. president. Now, one has to wonder, after 60 years, what's so sensitive to release about this crime? You might have to ask Mr. Biden that at his next press conference, whenever it is slated.
I think in looking at this, we see, the government worked with Lucky Luciano during World War II on the docks of New York. They worked in Havana notoriously in trying to take out Fidel Castro. So the connection between U.S. intelligence and I'll put it like this. It seems to me that the U.S. intelligence agencies and the mafia have been inextricably linked for as long as we've had U.S. intelligence agencies. 1 minute.
Well, that is unavoidably the case. And that coalition has played a particularly noxious role, I'm afraid to say, in Italy, where at one time you had Western Europe's strongest communist party. But in the pivotal Italian election of 1947, you saw that the U.S. intelligence agencies and the organized crime factions collaborated in order to try to repress the vote of the Communist Party. And recall in the 1970s, a few decades later, when the Christian Democratic leader Aldo Moro was assassinated, once again, there was apparent complicity by the U.S. intelligence agencies, a subject which has fascinated Italian filmmakers who have made a number of movies about that crime.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.